Marcus Thompson had been cleaning the floors of the Elite Combat Academy for 3 years. Every evening at 6 o'clock sharp, he would arrive with his cart full of supplies ready to mop the training mats and wipe down the mirrors that reflected the dreams of countless martial artists. At 52 years old, Marcus moved with a quiet dignity that most people overlooked. To them, he was just the janitor, invisible, unremarkable, someone who existed in the background of their important lives. The academy buzzed with activity during peak hours. Students in crisp white uniforms practiced their forms, their black belts tied with precision around their waists. The sound of bare feet slapping against mats mixed with sharp exhales and the occasional grunt of exertion. Marcus had watched thousands of these training sessions while he worked, observing techniques and movements with the careful eye of someone who understood more than he let on. Jake Morrison was the academy's star pupil and assistant instructor. At 28, he carried himself with the swagger of someone who had never truly been tested outside the controlled environment of tournament competition. His third-degree black belt was earned through years of dedicated training, but his character had never been forged in the fires of real adversity. Jake had a habit of making jokes at the expense of others, especially those he considered beneath his social status. On this particular Tuesday evening, Jake was finishing up a private lesson with one of his students when he noticed Marcus methodically cleaning the corner where they had been practicing. The student had left, and the academy was nearly empty except for a few stragglers packing up their gear. Jake's friends, fellow black belts who hung around to feed off his energy, were lounging on the benches, scrolling through their phones and discussing weekend plans. "Hey guys, watch this," Jake said with a smirk, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "I bet our janitor here thinks he could take on a real martial artist." His friends looked up, sensing entertainment coming their way. They had seen Jake's cruel humor before, but it never got old for them. Marcus continued cleaning, pretending not to hear, but his movements became slightly more deliberate. Jake approached Marcus with exaggerated confidence, his black belt swaying with each step. "Tell me something, old man," he said, using a tone that was meant to sound friendly but carried an unmistakable edge of condescension. "You've been watching us train for years now. Ever wonder what it would be like to step onto these mats as something other than the cleaning crew?" Marcus straightened up slowly, wringing out his mop with steady hands. His dark eyes met Jake's for just a moment before he returned to his work. "I'm just here to clean, sir," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had learned when to pick his battles. But Jake wasn't satisfied with that response. He was showing off now and his audience was watching. "Come on, don't be modest. I bet you've picked up a few moves just from watching us, right? Maybe you practice a little at home, throw some punches at the mirror." The other black belts chuckled, enjoying the show. Marcus continued working, but something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Those who knew how to look would have recognized the subtle change, the way his weight distributed more evenly, the slight adjustment in his stance. But Jake and his friends were too busy enjoying their superiority to notice such details. "I'll tell you what," Jake announced, his voice carrying across the nearly empty academy. "How about we have a little friendly demonstration? Nothing serious, just some light sparring. I could show you a few basic techniques, give you a taste of what real martial arts feels like." He turned to his friends with a theatrical wink. Might be fun to see how someone with no training handles themselves against a black belt. Marcus set down his mop and turned to face Jake fully for the first time. There was something different in his eyes now. Not anger, but a kind of weary recognition. He had encountered men like Jake before, in places far more dangerous than a suburban martial arts academy. "That's very kind of you to offer, sir, but I should get back to my work. The floors won't clean themselves." Jake's friends were now fully invested in the entertainment. "Come on, Marcus," one of them called out. "Don't be a chicken. Jake's a great teacher, he'll go easy on you." Another chimed in. "Yeah, it could be educational. When will you get another chance to learn from a real black belt?" The pressure was building and Jake was feeding off the energy. He had painted himself into a corner where backing down would make him look weak in front of his peers. "Look, Marcus, I'm not trying to embarrass you. This is a learning opportunity. We'll just do some light contact, maybe work on some basic defensive positions. Nothing that could hurt an older guy like you." Marcus glanced around the academy, taking in the mirrors that had reflected so many moments of triumph and defeat. The mats that had absorbed the sweat of countless warriors, the heavy bags that hung like silent sentinels in the corner. He thought about his grandson who would be starting middle school soon and dealing with bullies of his own. Sometimes Marcus knew a man had to take a stand not for himself but for the principle of the thing. "All right," Marcus said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "If it means that much to you, I suppose I could spare a few minutes." He began rolling up his sleeves with deliberate care, revealing forearms that bore the kind of scars that came from real combat, not tournament competition. Jake's excitement was palpable. He started stretching dramatically, making a show of loosening up his shoulders and rotating his neck. "Great, this is going to be fun. Don't worry, Marcus, I'll control my techniques. We don't want you getting hurt on the job." His friends moved closer, some pulling out phones to record what they assumed would be a humorous mismatch. As Jake continued his warm-up routine, Marcus simply stood quietly, his breathing steady and controlled. He wasn't stretching or bouncing around like the younger man. Instead, he seemed to be settling into himself, finding a center of gravity that ran deeper than physical balance. His work clothes, like a simple gray uniform shirt and dark eye pants, and seemed suddenly less like the costume of a service worker and more like the practical gear of someone who understood that real confrontations rarely happened in pristine white uniforms. "Okay, let's start with some basic positioning," Jake announced, dropping into his fighting stance with theatrical flair. It was a textbook position, perfectly executed according to the classical forms he had learned. His left foot forward, hands raised in precise guard position, weight distributed exactly as his instructors had taught him. He looked like a poster child for traditional martial arts. Marcus simply stood there, his hands at his sides, looking almost relaxed. To the observers, it appeared that he had no idea what he was doing. Jake smiled confidently. "Remember, Marcus, try to keep your guard up. Protect your head and body. When I throw a technique, do your best to block or move away." The first exchange happened so quickly that the spectators almost missed it. Jake threw a controlled front kick aimed at Marcus's midsection, the kind of technique designed to demonstrate superior skill without causing real harm. It was perfectly executed, with proper form and measured force. Marcus moved just slightly, a subtle shift that seemed almost casual. Jake's kick found nothing but air, and somehow Marcus was standing in a different position, though no one could quite explain how he had gotten there. Jake's confidence flickered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. "Good footwork," Jake said, though there was a slight edge to his voice now. "Let's try that again, but this time try to counterattack. Show me what you think you know about fighting." Jake launched into a combination that he had perfected through years of training. A jab followed by a cross, then a low kick to Marcus's lead leg. Each technique was delivered with precision and control, exactly the way he had been taught. In tournaments, this combination had earned him numerous victories. Against training partners, it demonstrated his superior skill and timing. But Marcus wasn't a training partner or a tournament opponent. As Jake's punches came forward, Marcus seemed to disappear from their path without any dramatic movements. There was no fancy footwork, no elaborate defensive techniques, just an economy of motion that made Jake's attacks look slow and clumsy by comparison. When Jake's leg kick came, Marcus simply wasn't there anymore, and Jake found himself off balance, having committed to striking empty space. The watching black belt stopped laughing. Something was happening that didn't fit their understanding of how these encounters should go. Marcus still hadn't thrown a single offensive technique, yet Jake was the one who looked frustrated and out of sorts. "Stop running away," Jake snapped, his composure beginning to crack. "This is supposed to be sparring, not hide and seek." Marcus remained calm, his breathing unchanged despite the activity. "I'm not running anywhere, son. I'm right here." His voice carried a quiet authority that seemed to fill the space around them. Jake's friends exchanged uncertain glances. The dynamic they had expected to witness was shifting into something they didn't recognize. Determined to reassert his dominance, Jake increased his intensity. He threw a spinning back kick, an advanced technique that required significant skill and flexibility. It was the kind of move that impressed spectators and overwhelmed less experienced opponents. Jake had landed this kick countless times in controlled environments, and it had never failed to demonstrate his superior abilities. Marcus watched the kick coming with the patient attention of someone reading a familiar book. As Jake spun, committing his entire body to the technique, Marcus stepped forward rather than away. Suddenly, Jake found himself spinning past his target, his back exposed, his balance compromised. Marcus could have struck him in any number of ways, but instead he simply placed a gentle hand on Jake's shoulder as the younger man stumbled past. "Careful there," Marcus said softly. "These mats can be slippery when you're moving that fast." The touch was brief and seemed supportive, but Jake felt the unmistakable strength in those fingers, the kind of grip that came from decades of real physical labor and genuine struggle. Jake straightened up, his face flushed with embarrassment and growing anger. His friends were no longer recording, having put away their phones as the entertainment value of the situation evaporated. What they were witnessing wasn't the light-hearted domination they had expected. Instead, their champion was being systematically neutralized by a man who appeared to be doing nothing at all. "You're just getting lucky with your timing," Jake said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "Let's see how you handle some real pressure." He began circling Marcus with predatory intensity, looking for an opening to unleash a decisive combination that would end this embarrassing display. Marcus turned slowly to keep Jake in view, his movements minimal and efficient. To the untrained eye, he still looked like he didn't know what he was doing. But those with real experience would have recognized the signs, the way he maintained perfect distance, the subtle positioning that kept him in the safest possible location relative to his opponent, the complete absence of wasted motion or nervous energy. Jake feinted with his left hand, then threw a powerful right cross aimed at Marcus's head. It was delivered with genuine intent now, the kind of punch that could seriously hurt an unprepared opponent. Jake's pride was on the line, and he was no longer concerned with holding back for the sake of the older man's safety. The punch never landed. Marcus's head moved just enough to let it pass by, and somehow his own hand was suddenly resting against Jake's extended arm. Not grabbing, not striking, just touching, as if he were pointing out an interesting detail to a curious student. But that gentle contact was enough to redirect Jake's momentum, sending him stumbling forward several steps before he could regain his balance. The academy fell completely silent except for the sound of Jake's labored breathing. He had been throwing techniques for several minutes now, each one more aggressive than the last, while Marcus had barely seemed to exert himself. Sweat was beginning to show on Jake's forehead, and his movements were becoming less crisp as frustration clouded his judgment. "What are you doing?" Jake demanded, his voice rising with a mixture of confusion and anger. "Fight back! Throw a punch! Do something!" His friends watched in uncomfortable silence, no longer sure who they should be rooting for. The situation had evolved beyond their simple expectations of entertainment at an older man's expense. Marcus finally spoke, his voice carrying the patient tone of a teacher addressing a struggling student. "Son, you're trying too hard. All that energy you're putting into those techniques, where do you think it goes when they don't land?" He gestured slightly with his hands, a subtle movement that somehow seemed to encompass the entire space around them. "Every attack creates an opportunity for whoever knows how to see it." Jake's face darkened with humiliation. Here he was, a third-degree black belt with years of training and tournament victories, being lectured on martial arts by a janitor who hadn't even thrown a single punch. The injustice of it, the impossibility of it, filled him with a rage that overwhelmed his tactical thinking. He charged forward with a wild combination of punches and kicks, abandoning the controlled techniques of his formal training in favor of aggressive volume. If precision wasn't working, perhaps sheer intensity would overwhelm this mysterious old man who seemed to dance around his attacks like smoke, avoiding a grasping hand. Marcus didn't retreat from the storm of techniques coming his way. Instead, he moved through them like water flowing around stones in a stream. Each of Jake's attacks missed by the narrowest of margins, but those tiny gaps were as wide as canyons to someone who understood the true geometry of combat. Marcus's movements were so subtle that the watching black belts couldn't even identify specific techniques. He simply seemed to exist in the spaces where Jake's attacks weren't. After 30 seconds of furious, fruitless assault, Jake stumbled backward, breathing hard and wild-eyed. He had thrown everything he knew at this man, and none of it had connected. Worse, he could see in Marcus's calm expression that the older man wasn't even breathing hard. It was as if Jake had been shadowboxing while Marcus watched with polite interest. "How?" Jake gasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "How are you doing this? Who are you?" The questions came out in a rush, carrying all the confusion and shattered assumptions of the past few minutes. Marcus was quiet for a moment, studying Jake's face with something that might have been compassion. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of hard-earned wisdom. "I'm nobody special, son. Just an old man who learned a long time ago that the strongest technique isn't always the one that lands the hardest. Sometimes it's the one that doesn't have to land at all." One of Jake's friends finally found his voice. "Marcus, I don't understand. Where did you learn to move like that? That's not normal defensive movement." The young man's voice carried genuine curiosity rather than mockery, as if he had witnessed something that challenged everything he thought he knew about martial arts. Marcus glanced around at the assembled group. These young men who had moments before been so confident in their superiority. Now they looked like children who had discovered that their understanding of the world was far smaller than they had believed. "I spent some time in places where fighting wasn't a sport," he said simply. "Places where second place meant you didn't come home. You learn different things when the stakes are real." The implication of his words settled over the group like a heavy blanket. These young men had earned their rank in a controlled environment, with rules and referees and safety equipment. They had never faced true danger, never been tested by genuine desperation or life-and-death circumstances. Marcus's calm demeanor suddenly made perfect sense. This was a man who had been forged in fires they couldn't even imagine. Jake sank down onto one of the benches, his head in his hands. The weight of what had just happened was crushing his sense of identity. Everything he had believed about himself, his skills, his place in the hierarchy of martial arts, had been shattered in a matter of minutes by a man he had dismissed as irrelevant. "I don't understand," he said, his voice muffled by his palms. "I've been training since I was 12. I've won tournaments. I teach classes. How could you make me look like I've never thrown a punch in my life?" Marcus picked up his mop and began cleaning again, as if the extraordinary demonstration had been nothing more than a brief interruption in his normal routine. But he spoke as he worked, his voice gentle but clear. "Son, there's a difference between learning to fight and learning to survive. Your techniques are beautiful, precise, powerful, exactly what your instructors taught you. But they were designed for a world with rules." One of the other young men stepped forward hesitantly. "What do you mean by that, Marcus? Fighting is fighting, isn't it?" His earlier arrogance had been replaced by genuine curiosity, the hunger of a student who had just realized how much he didn't know. Marcus paused in his cleaning, considering how to explain concepts that couldn't really be taught in a classroom. When you're in a tournament, both fighters know the rules. You bow to each other. You wait for the referee's signal. You fight until someone scores points or time runs out. There's honor in that, and skill, and years of dedication. "I'm not taking anything away from what you've accomplished." He resumed mopping but continued speaking. "But real violence doesn't wait for you to get ready. It doesn't care about your belt rank or how many trophies you've won. It comes at you when you're tired or distracted or scared. And it doesn't stop when you tap out or when a referee blows a whistle." Jake looked up from his hands, his eyes red with embarrassment and dawning understanding. "You were in the military, weren't you? Special forces or something?" It was a guess, but it felt right. The way Marcus moved, the calm under pressure, the economy of motion. These weren't things you learned in a suburban dojo. Marcus smiled slightly, the first real expression of warmth he had shown since the encounter began. "Marines, actually. 3 tours in places you've probably seen on the news but hopefully never had to visit. Learned a lot of hard lessons about what works and what gets you killed." He wrung out the mop with practiced efficiency. "When I came back, I tried training in places like this. But everything felt too slow, too predictable. Like learning to swim in a pool when you'd already survived in the ocean." The group of young black belts exchanged glances, beginning to understand the magnitude of what they had witnessed. They had challenged someone who had fought for his life in real combat, someone for whom their carefully controlled techniques were as familiar and predictable as a children's game. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" another student asked. "All these years you've been watching us train, listening to us talk about martial arts, and you never mentioned that you actually know how to fight?" Marcus leaned on his mop handle, considering the question seriously. What would have been the point? You all were learning good things. Discipline, respect, physical fitness, confidence. Those are valuable lessons that will serve you well in life. Just because I learned different lessons in different circumstances doesn't make yours worthless. Jake stood up slowly, his legs still shaky from the adrenaline and exertion of his failed attacks. "But you could have taught us so much more. Real techniques, practical applications." His voice trailed off as he realized how presumptuous he sounded. Could I? Marcus asked gently. The things I learned were for very specific situations, son. Life and death situations that I pray none of you ever have to face. You want to learn to defend yourself, to be confident, to be strong. That's noble. But what I know comes from a dark place, and it's meant for dark purposes. Better that you learn to fight with honor than to survive without it. The academy felt different now, charged with new understanding. These young men who had arrived that evening feeling confident in their abilities now stood humbled by the realization of how vast their ignorance truly was. Marcus had given them a gift more valuable than any technique. He had shown them the limits of their knowledge and the importance of humility. Jake approached Marcus slowly, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching reverence. Marcus, I owe you an apology. A big one. I was showing off, trying to embarrass you in front of my friends and you. You could have destroyed me at any point, couldn't you? His voice carried the weight of genuine remorse and growing understanding. Marcus finished cleaning the section of mat where their encounter had taken place, his movements deliberate and thorough. Destroying someone isn't the goal, son. That's another difference between what you've learned and what I had to learn. Your martial arts are about improvement, competition, personal growth. What I know is about ending threats as quickly and efficiently as possible. There's no honor in using those skills against someone who isn't actually threatening you. The other young men gathered closer, drawn by the profound shift in the evening's dynamic. They were no longer spectators to entertainment, but witnesses to a masterclass in wisdom and restraint. So when Jake was attacking you, one of them asked hesitantly, you were never in any real danger? Marcus considered the question carefully, setting his mop aside and giving them his full attention for the first time. Danger is always relative. Your friend here is strong, well-trained, and capable of causing real harm to someone who wasn't prepared for it. But preparation comes in many forms: physical preparation, mental preparation, and the kind of situational awareness that becomes second nature when your life has depended on it. Jake shook his head in amazement. I threw everything I had at you. Every technique I've learned over 15 years of training. And you made it look like I was moving in slow motion. He paused, struggling with the implications. How many people are out there like you? People who know things we don't even know exist? More than you'd think, Marcus replied quietly. Veterans. People who've grown up in rough neighborhoods, individuals who've faced real violence and survived it. The world is full of people who've learned hard lessons that don't get taught in martial arts schools. That's not a criticism of your training. It's just reality. The lead instructor, Master Kim, emerged from his office where he had been working on administrative tasks. He stopped short when he saw the unusual gathering around Marcus, the subdued expressions on his students' faces, and the unmistakable atmosphere of something significant having occurred. Is everything all right out here? He asked, his experienced eye taking in the details of the scene. Jake looked at his instructor, then back at Marcus, struggling to find words that could adequately explain what had transpired. Master Kim, we just learned something important about assumptions and respect. His voice carried a maturity that hadn't been there an hour earlier, and about the difference between knowing techniques and understanding combat. Master Kim's eyebrows rose slightly. He had been teaching martial arts for over 20 years, and he recognized the look on his students' faces, the expression of people who had just had their worldview fundamentally altered. His gaze shifted to Marcus, taking in the older man's calm demeanor and the subtle signs of someone comfortable with violence. I see, he said thoughtfully. And what prompted this learning experience? Marcus straightened up, meeting the instructor's gaze with quiet respect. Your students were curious about practical applications, sir. I was able to share some perspective based on different experiences. His words were carefully chosen, diplomatically understating the events while acknowledging the instructor's authority in his own academy. Over the following weeks, the atmosphere in the elite combat academy underwent a gradual but profound transformation. Jake's attitude toward training shifted from performance-focused aggression to thoughtful study. He began asking different questions, seeking to understand not just how techniques worked, but when and why they might be applicable. His treatment of Marcus became a model of respect and recognition. The other students followed suit, greeting Marcus warmly each evening and occasionally asking respectful questions about his perspective on various aspects of self-defense. Marcus always answered thoughtfully, sharing wisdom about awareness, de-escalation, and the importance of avoiding conflict whenever possible. While never revealing specific techniques or encouraging violence, Master Kim, recognizing an opportunity to deepen his students' understanding, occasionally invited Marcus to share thoughts during advanced classes about the mental aspects of self-defense. Marcus always emphasized the psychological and philosophical elements rather than physical techniques, teaching lessons about confidence, situational awareness, and the responsibility that came with knowledge of violence. Jake eventually approached Marcus privately one evening, asking if there was anything he could do to make amends for his earlier behavior. Marcus smiled and suggested that Jake might consider volunteering at a local youth center, sharing his martial arts knowledge with kids who could benefit from the discipline and confidence that proper training could provide. It was, Marcus explained, a way to use his skills to build people up rather than tear them down. The story of that evening became something of a legend in the academy, passed down to new students as a lesson about humility, respect, and the vast difference between technical knowledge and true understanding. And Marcus continued to clean the floors each evening, moving with the same quiet dignity he had always possessed, but now recognized and appreciated by everyone who shared that space with him.